There are truths that are not buried because they are wrong, but because they are too dangerous for those who hold the power to tell the story. And this story begins in exactly that place. Not in the familiar Jerusalem of textbooks, not in Rome or Europe where Bibles are printed by the millions. It begins in a place very few people are taught to look toward, the high mountains of Ethiopia, where time moves slowly, where memory refuses to die, and where another Bible is still being read in the voices of ancestors. They tell you the Bible has 66 books. You grow up with that number, believing it like a law of nature, like the sun rising in the east. But what if I told you that in Ethiopia, people read a Bible with 81 books, and they have read it continuously for more than 1,000 years, without interruption, without asking anyone for permission? Not a copy, but a living tradition, sung in the ancient language of Ge'ez, a tongue that carries the breath of Hebrew and the desert, of prayer and flesh and blood. The question is not why you have never heard of it. The real question is why you were not taught it. Because when a story is cut down, it does not only lose words, it loses its soul. And when the soul is taken away, people begin to forget who they are. In America, in the streets where Black history is often told as beginning with chains and ending with struggle, there are people who stand up and say that story is not enough. They do not ask for pity. They do not ask to be included. They say it plainly. We did not begin as slaves. We began with a covenant. They call themselves Black Hebrew Israelites, and that name alone is enough to make many people uncomfortable. They say their ancestors were not nameless people taken from African forests, but descendants of the 12 tribes of Israel, people who were exiled, stripped of their true names, forced to forget their language, and taught to worship God in the way of those who chained them. For them, the Bible is not a tool of slave masters. It is a case file. Every line is a clue, every prophecy is a scar that has not healed. When they read Deuteronomy, they do not read it like a fairy tale. They hear the sound of waves. They see the ships. They see bodies being sold, families torn apart, names replaced with numbers. And they ask one very simple, very dangerous question. If this is not talking about us, then who is it talking about? But to understand why these people look toward Ethiopia, we have to go farther than America. We have to leave behind modern churches, where God is often painted to look like a European man, and return to places where the Bible was never made whiter, neater, and safer. Ethiopia does not appear in the Bible as a side note. It appears as part of the sacred world, where Cush is named, where prophets say that from beyond the rivers, worshippers will come. In Ethiopia, the Bible was not closed. It was not limited by any council, not cut away for being too mysterious, too deep, or too inconvenient. Books like Enoch, Jubilees are not called apocrypha. They are treated as family memory. And when you hold memory long enough, it stops being legend. It becomes identity. What makes this story unsettle so many people is not that it is certainly true, but that it could be true. It opens the possibility that the history you were taught is only an edited version, that there were centers of power that decided which books were kept, which were removed, and more importantly, which people were allowed to be seen in the story of God. If Ethiopia truly preserved an older tradition of the Bible, fuller, then that means the light did not always shine from north to south. Maybe it traveled the other way. And if Black communities have held faith, law, and the memory of Israel for thousands of years, then being called outsiders says more about the modern world than it does about them. This story does not begin with an argument. It begins with a crack in the solid wall of Orthodox truth, a crack large enough for light to slip in. And when that light shines on Ethiopia, on an 81-book Bible, on people who say we know who we are, no one can pretend that everything is still as simple as before. Because once you begin to question the Bible, you will soon question history. And when history is questioned, power will tremble. This is not a story meant to make you comfortable. This is a story meant to wake you up, slowly, layer by layer, like someone remembering an old dream they were once taught to forget. When a person is robbed of their history, they live their entire life like a tenant inside their own body. They walk on the land, speak a language, carry a name, but somewhere deep inside there is always a question that refuses to be silent. Where did I come from? And it is in that empty space that the Black Hebrew Israelites movement begins to speak. Not in whispers, but in the voice of those who have been silent for far too long. The people standing on street corners, in small churches, or in the middle of city parks do not begin with apologies. They begin with declarations. They say that Black history did not begin on slave ships, but ended there. That before being chained, their ancestors had law, had covenant, had a God who called them by a personal name, and that name was not slave, not Negro, but Israel. For many on the outside, this sounds like a shock, even an offense, but for those inside the movement, it feels like a door opening after generations of living in a room with no windows. Black Hebrew Israelites do not only read the Bible, they confront it. They turn every page and ask why the stories of exile, punishment, and loss look so much like their own lives. They find themselves in ancient warnings, where God says his people will be scattered, made to forget their identity, placed under the yoke of other nations. And when they read the passage that says those people will be taken by ships to a distant land, where they will be sold and no one will save them, many no longer see it as a symbol. They see it as memory written down before it happened. This movement was not born in peace. It grew in a century when Black Americans were trying to straighten their backs after generations of being bent. At the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th, figures like Frank Cherry and William Saunders Crowdy began to say things society did not want to hear. They said that Jesus did not look like the image hanging on the walls of white churches. They said that those called Jews today might not be the only ones carrying the blood of Israel. These words were not spoken to please anyone. They were spoken because those who said them believed God had shown them something the world was deliberately hiding. They formed communities, not large, not wealthy, but bound together by the belief that the Bible was their book before it was used to justify their oppression. What makes this movement endure is not social approval, but the feeling of restoring order in a chaotic world. When official history says your ancestors had nothing before capture, Black Hebrew Israelites say your ancestors once had everything, and that is why they were struck down. This is a complete reversal of the familiar story, and not everyone is ready to accept it. But behind the heated arguments lies a very human truth. When a community is stripped of language, names, and collective memory, they will try to piece the fragments back together with whatever remains. For Black Hebrew Israelites, those fragments lie in the Bible, in stories they believe were misread, mistranslated, or deliberately blurred. They do not see the Bible as a neutral text. They see it as a torn map, and they are trying to piece it together to find their way home. And in that process, Ethiopia begins to appear as a point of light, not as a romantic idea, but as a real place, where the Bible was never cut down, where Black people were not treated as outsiders to the story of God. When they hear that in Ethiopia there are communities that have kept the laws of Israel for thousands of years, that there is a fuller Bible, that there are traditions that did not pass through Europe, they begin to ask questions. If this exists, why was it not taught? And if it was not taught, how many other things have been forgotten? The Black Hebrew Israelites movement is not uniform. There are moderate groups seeking identity and spiritual discipline. There are also hardline groups speaking with the anger of those who have not yet healed. But in every form, they share one thing: they refuse to accept that their story begins with defeat. For them, saying we are Israel is not only a statement of lineage, it is an act of resistance. It is a way of saying history did not kill us, and neither did memory. And when they look toward Ethiopia, they are not only searching for proof, they are searching for a mirror, a place where black people do not stand at the end of the line, but at the center of a sacred story. From that point, the flow of the story begins to shift. It is no longer only America and its pain, but a longer, older journey where questions of language, blood, and covenant begin to intersect. And once these questions are asked, no one can return to the old way of reading the Bible without feeling that something has changed. There is a very strange moment that happens when people begin to read the Bible with their own eyes, instead of eyes borrowed from someone else. That is when words that once felt familiar suddenly become heavy, as if they had been waiting for the right person to understand them. For many black people in America, that moment comes when they read the words about exile, about losing identity, about being scattered among nations, and realize that this is not just the story of some ancient people far away. It is the story of their families, their neighborhoods, and themselves. Deuteronomy is no longer an ancient law book. It becomes a narration of a broken path, the warnings about Israel being stripped of its name, forced to worship the gods of others, placed under the yoke of nations that do not understand them, echo like sounds rising from the hold of a slave ship. When the Bible speaks of children being sold before the eyes of their parents, of no one stepping in to redeem them, many people do not need imagination. They only need memory passed down through family stories, through silences no one wants to mention. In this way of reading, the Bible is not gentle. It does not comfort by helping people forget their pain. Instead, it calls pain by its name and places it within a sacred order. That brings strength, and it also brings controversy. Because if pain has meaning, then history is no longer a series of meaningless accidents. And if history has meaning, then those who rewrote it must be held accountable. Many who oppose this reading say it is too personal, too emotional, but those inside the movement ask in return, what history is not read through human experience? When a community is stripped of its voice, emotion becomes the last thing left to hold on to. And from that emotion, they build a system of meaning that helps them stand upright in a society that constantly tells them they came from nothing. It is at this point that the story begins to spread beyond the walls of small churches or noisy street corners, because the questions being asked are not only for believers, but for anyone who has ever felt they had no place in the larger story of humanity. If you have ever wondered why your ancestors appear in history only as victims, if you have ever struggled to accept that the God of the whole world carries only the face of one group of people, then you may understand why many stop to listen. Some listen and resist, some listen and remain silent, and some listen and then begin to speak their own thoughts, begin to stay longer, wanting to follow this journey all the way through, not because they believe immediately, but because they feel something real is being touched, something that for a long time no one dared to touch. This story does not ask you to agree. It only asks you to stay long enough to listen, because when a story has been pushed to the margins for too long, the first thing needed is not judgment, but space for it to be told fully. And perhaps that is why more and more people choose to keep watching, keep reflecting, keep asking questions instead of rushing to close a door that has just begun to open. When Black Hebrew Israelites speak of curses and restoration, they are not only talking about the past, they are talking about the present, where Black people still struggle to be seen as whole human beings. They are talking about the future, where remembering identity is no longer an act of rebellion, but the first step toward healing. In their world, Restoration does not come from being accepted by the system, but from returning to the laws and memories they believe were given from the beginning. But not everyone can bear the weight of this perspective, because accepting that the Bible may speak directly about the Black experience forces society to face uncomfortable questions about the role of religion in sustaining oppression. It forces people to reconsider how God was turned into a tool instead of a source of liberation. Amid all these debates, Ethiopia still stands there like a silent witness, a land where the Bible was never separated from Africa, a place where prayer does not carry the tone of a conqueror, but the breath of communities who have lived with it for generations. And it is from Ethiopia that new questions begin to form, no longer centered only on pain, but on deeper, older memory. If the curses in the Bible can be read as Black history, then the promises of restoration cannot be ignored. And if there is a place in the world that has preserved those promises through books, rituals, and daily life, then that place cannot continue to be treated as an exception. It must be placed back at the center of the story. Perhaps that is why many people, after reaching this point, do not rush away. They want to know what Ethiopia truly holds. They want to know what the removed books say. And they want to understand why these stories, even when uncomfortable, continue to live stubbornly in the minds of those searching for themselves. If you find yourself wondering the same, then staying, listening, and sharing your thoughts is not unusual. It is simply a natural step in the journey of seeking truth. There are lands that do not need to speak in order to be remembered. They stand there quietly, carrying stories longer than any empire. Ethiopia is such a place, not a destination of modern spiritual tourism, but a land where time flows by a different rhythm, where memory is not rewritten each time power changes hands. When the story of the Black Hebrew Israelites begins to expand beyond America, Ethiopia appears not as a hypothesis, but as a witness that was there before the debate even began. In the Bible, Ethiopia does not appear as a foreign land. It is called by its ancient name Cush, and that name carries a weight many have grown used to overlooking. Cush was not a shadow at the margins of Israel, but part of the ancient world where peoples traded, married, and shared faith. Moses, considered the greatest lawgiver of Israel, married a Cushite woman. That story is not told as a mistake to be hidden, but as a reality protected by God, even though it once disturbed those closest to him. The prophets also did not speak of Ethiopia with contempt. Zephaniah mentions worshippers coming from beyond the rivers of Cush, bringing offerings to God. In that prophecy, Africa is not a place of darkness, but a place of return. Yet over centuries, those words were gradually skimmed over, treated as symbolic imagery rather than serious guidance about geography and people. What makes Ethiopia different is not only the references in the Bible, but the way they lived with the Bible. While many regions passed through religious wars, reforms, and denominational splits, Ethiopia kept its own current. Ethiopian Orthodoxy did not develop under the patronage of Rome or Constantinople. It grew on African soil, with rhythms of life, rituals, and language that were never forced to resemble anyone else. Ge'ez, the language of the Ethiopian Bible, is not a dead tongue stored in a museum. It is sung, prayed, and passed down from generation to generation. Ethiopian priests do not only read the Bible, they live inside it. And within those pages are texts that the West chose not to carry with them when shaping their version of the Bible. The continuous existence of those books raises an uncomfortable question. If these texts were once widely read in early Christian communities, if they were quoted in the New Testament, then what caused them to be removed elsewhere? And more importantly, why was Ethiopia able to keep them without feeling the need to apologize? For those searching for identity, this question is not purely academic. It is existential, because if Ethiopia preserved a fuller, older Bible, then it may also have preserved a memory that other places lost. And that memory is not only about books, but about who is seen in the story of God and who is pushed outside of it. When Black Hebrew Israelites look toward Ethiopia, they are not only seeking a place to confirm belief, they are seeking a precedent, a living proof that Black people were not always outsiders to the Israelite tradition, that there were Black communities who kept law, ritual, and scripture without Europe standing in to validate them. This unsettles the assumption that religious authority must always flow from north to south, from white to black. Not everyone accepts this perspective. Many scholars argue that directly linking African Americans to ancient Ethiopia is too great a leap. But for those searching for themselves, the greatest distance is not geography, but centuries of silence. When a story has been silenced long enough, reconnecting it will always be labeled extreme, whether it has foundation or not. Ethiopia, in that context, becomes a place that interrupts the silence. It does not confirm every claim, but it proves that the history of Israel is not confined to the borders we are used to. It proves that Africa was not only a receiver of religion from the outside, but a place that preserved and transformed that religion in its own way, over a long and enduring span. There is something difficult to deny when looking at Ethiopia. A community cannot preserve ritual, language, and sacred texts for more than a millennium without a deep foundation. Whether you believe every tradition or not, that endurance itself is a message. It says there are paths of faith that do not pass through centers of power, yet still survive and grow. From this point, the story begins to move into a deeper layer. Not only that Ethiopia kept the Bible, but that Ethiopia kept a story of origin, of kingship, of covenant that the outside world rarely pauses to hear. A story tied to a powerful woman, a wise king, and a child born between two worlds. These stories are not told to please scholars or satisfy debate. They are told to explain why Ethiopia believes it does not stand outside the history of Israel, but within its current. And when the story of the Queen of Sheba begins to echo, not as a brief anecdote, but as the foundation of an entire dynasty, many things once considered impossible begin to feel thinkable. Because when history is retold from the perspective of those who preserved it in silence, it no longer looks the same. It becomes deeper, more complex, and harder to dismiss. Ethiopia does not ask the world to believe immediately. It simply stands there with its books, rituals, and memory, forcing anyone serious about seeking truth to stop and look more closely. And when you stop long enough, you begin to realize that this story is not only about a distant land. It is about how memory can survive violence, erasure, and even doubt. It says that some things are preserved not by power, but by patience and the enduring faith of communities that refuse to disappear. There are books that were never lost. They were only abandoned by places that no longer wanted to hear what they had to say. In Ethiopia, those books never disappeared. They rest in the hands of priests, in rock-hewn monasteries, in hymns sung from throats shaped by the breath of desert and high mountains. When the Western world calls them removed, Ethiopia calls them by another name, the Bible. When you step into the world of the Ethiopian Bible, one thing becomes clear immediately. Here, the story is not shortened to fit convenience. It is longer, deeper, and sometimes more uncomfortable. 81 books is not a number meant for display. It is a sign of a tradition that was never in a hurry to decide what should be kept and what should be forgotten. Books like Enoch and Jubilees are not read as appendices. They are read as ancient voices that still matter. The Book of Enoch tells stories many people have never heard in their churches. It speaks of fallen angels, of beings born between heaven and earth, of forbidden knowledge and the consequences of humans touching what they were not ready for. But what makes Enoch controversial is not only its mystical content, it is the way it speaks about the order of the world, about lineage, about how corruption is not only personal but can pass through generations. For communities that have endured deep rupture, like Black people through the history of slavery, such stories are not imagination. They are language for a world that has been broken, where things no longer sit where they belong. And when Enoch speaks of knowledge being stolen, misused, and then hidden away, many hear echoes of their own history. The Book of Jubilees moves in a different direction, but with no less force. It retells Genesis and Exodus with intense focus on lineage, on law, on keeping time, seasons, and covenant with precision. Jubilees leaves little room for vagueness. It insists that sacred memory cannot survive if discipline is loosened. To many modern readers, this sounds harsh, but to communities that once lost everything, discipline becomes the last way to hold on to something. What is striking is that these books were not inventions of Ethiopia. They once circulated widely in early Jewish and Christian worlds. They were quoted, debated, and respected. But when religious councils began shaping an official Bible, these books were gradually set aside. The reasons given were often that they were too difficult, too symbolic, or incompatible with doctrines being solidified. Yet removing a book is never only a theological decision. It is always a decision of power. When you decide which books are read, you also decide which stories are told, and which people are seen inside those stories. Ethiopia, by keeping these books, refused to take part in that narrowing process. Not out of rebellion, but because their tradition never saw a reason to cut away what had been handed down. For Black Hebrew Israelites, the existence of these books feels like a door opening behind walls they had been pushing against for years. If the Bible they were taught had been edited, if parts about lineage, exile, and restoration were blurred, then reading the unbroken text preserved in Ethiopia becomes an act of reclaiming breath. It gives them language for things the shortened Bible no longer had space to hold. But Ethiopia does not only keep books, it keeps a way of reading. Stories are not separated from land, from bloodline, from concrete history. When they read about Israel, they do not imagine an abstract idea. They imagine real people crossing deserts, building kingdoms, falling, and going into exile. And in that reading, Africa does not disappear. It remains present as part of the sacred map. This unsettles many people because it breaks the habit of seeing Africa as a late receiver of faith. If Ethiopia preserved such ancient traditions, then the assumption that religion always moved from the Middle East to Europe and only then to Africa begins to shake. Perhaps in some cases, the flow moved the other way. Perhaps what is called the center was not always where the noise was loudest. These questions are not meant to prove Ethiopia right and the rest of the world wrong. They are meant to widen a frame that has grown too narrow. Religious history is not a straight road. It is a network of journeys, exiles, and unexpected shelters. Ethiopia may have become such a place, not because of military or political power, but because of its capacity for silence and patience. In that silence, the books survived. The stories were carried not by printing presses, but by voices. And as long as the voice remains, the story is not finished. This is why Ethiopia does not see these books as forbidden. They were never forbidden here. They were simply never abandoned. When you stand before this reality, you begin to understand why the next part of the story carries such weight. Because if Ethiopia preserved books, preserved law, preserved memory, then the idea that it also preserved a story of kingship and covenant no longer feels far-fetched. And when that story centers on a powerful woman, a wise king, and a child of two bloodlines. It becomes more than legend. It becomes an explanation for the endurance of an entire people. Somewhere among those ancient pages, a name begins to rise with greater clarity. No longer just a passing figure in the Bible, but the heart of a tradition stretching across millennia. And once that name is spoken, the story can no longer remain still. It must move forward into the place where history, power, and faith collide in ways that cannot be ignored. There are stories that only need to be told long enough, patiently enough, and they will stand on their own without anyone defending them. The Ethiopian tradition of the Queen of Sheba is such a story. It does not exist to convince outsiders. It exists because those on the inside have lived with it for generations, like living with a family memory that does not need to be proven to the neighbors. In the Bible, familiar to many people, the Queen of Sheba appears only briefly. She comes to Jerusalem, tests Solomon's wisdom, is amazed by his wealth, and then leaves. The story ends quickly, as if it were only an interesting diplomatic visit. But in Ethiopia, that story does not end at the gates of Jerusalem. It only begins there. According to the tradition recorded in the Kebra Nagast, the Queen of Sheba is not a vague figure. She is Makeda, the Queen of Ethiopia, ruling a vast, wealthy, and organized kingdom. Her journey to Solomon is not driven by curiosity alone. It is a search for order, law, and a connection to God that Solomon represents. The two meet not only as monarchs but as seekers of the true source of power. The Ethiopian tradition says that this meeting led to a deeper bond, not a simple romance, but a crossing of two worlds. From this union, a child is born, named Menelik. This child grows up between two currents, carrying the memory of Jerusalem and the breath of Africa. When Menelik comes of age, he is sent to meet his father Solomon, to learn and to confirm his identity. According to the story, Solomon recognizes Menelik as his son and wants him to stay and inherit the throne of Israel. But Menelik does not choose that path. He chooses to return to Ethiopia, where he believes his mission lies. This decision is not told as a rejection, but as the completion of a greater plan. Solomon, instead of stopping him, blesses his son and sends with him the firstborn sons of Israelite nobles to establish a new kingdom on African soil. It is here that the story reaches the point that makes many people pause and take a deep breath. The Kebra Nagast says that those young men who traveled with Menelik carried the Ark of the Covenant, the most sacred object of Israel, the one that held the stone tablets of the Ten Commandments. Not a copy, but the true Ark. According to this tradition, what remained in Jerusalem was only a replacement image, while the true covenant had departed, finding a new refuge in Ethiopia. For many outsiders, this is the hardest detail to accept, but for Ethiopians, it is not a shock. It is an explanation for their endurance. If the Ark of the Covenant truly rests in Axum, then Ethiopia is not only a nation with an ancient Christian tradition, it is the keeper of the covenant, the inheritor of a sacred responsibility that the rest of the world has lost or diluted. To this day, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church maintains that the Ark of the Covenant is kept in Axum. In the Church of Mary of Zion, only one priest is allowed to see it. No one else may touch it. No one may photograph it. No one may examine it. To the modern mind, this sounds suspiciously mysterious. But to the ancient mind, this is the only way to protect the sacred from curiosity that would defile it. What matters is that this tradition is not new, not invented to serve any modern movement. It has existed for more than 2,000 years, told through art, ritual, and the way Ethiopians understand their own origins. Ethiopian emperors throughout history claimed descent from Solomon and Makeda. They did not see this as a myth to decorate power. They saw it as the foundation of their legitimacy. When archaeologists excavate in Axum, they find traces of an ancient civilization that once traded with Rome, India, and the Arabian Peninsula. Inscriptions in Greek, South Arabian, and Ge'ez show that Ethiopia was never isolated. It was a crossroads where religious and political ideas could travel and take root. In that context, the survival of an ancient Israelite tradition here no longer seems impossible. For Black Hebrew Israelites, this story is not just a fascinating legend, it is a crucial piece. If Ethiopia truly kept the covenant, if the lineage of Israel was planted on African soil in the time of Solomon, then Black people today finding themselves in the Bible is no longer an act of appropriation. It becomes an act of remembrance. But it is also here that tension begins, because if the covenant can move, if the center can shift, then many familiar assumptions must be re-examined. Religious history is no longer a straight line from Israel to Europe and then to the rest of the world. It becomes a network where Africa does not stand outside, but stands at a critical intersection. The story of the Queen of Sheba and Menelik does not ask you to believe immediately. It asks you to face the possibility that history is far more complex than the neat version taught in schools. It asks you to accept that some memories were preserved outside the spotlight of power, and that is why they look different, sound different, and feel uncomfortable. When Ethiopians tell this story, they do not speak with defiance. They speak with certainty, like people who know who they are and do not need to argue. And that certainty makes the listener wonder, if this story were completely groundless, how could it survive for so long? Through war, invasion, and changing dynasties. Perhaps the most important question is not whether the Ark of the Covenant truly rests in Axum. What matters more is that Ethiopia believes it has a responsibility to guard the covenant, guard the law, guard the memory, even as the world around them changes. That belief has shaped how they live, how they worship, and how they see themselves in the story of God. And as the story continues forward, from the ancient palaces of Axum to quiet communities on the highlands, one thing becomes clear. Ethiopia does not only preserve a legend, it preserves a way of seeing the world, where Black people do not stand outside sacred history, but flow within it from very early on. There is a truth often overlooked when people speak about faith and history. What survives the longest is not always what is protected by the greatest power, but what finds a place in everyday human life. In Ethiopia, the story of covenant, of Israel, of the Bible, does not sit quietly in ancient manuscripts. It lives in language, in music, in the way people eat, pray, and see the world around them. The Ge'ez language is a clear witness to this. It is not only a tool of communication, it is a storehouse of memory. When Ethiopian priests read the Bible in Ge'ez, they are not only reading words, they are reading rhythm, tone, and patterns of thought that are far closer to ancient Hebrew than many modern translations. Words for God, peace, covenant in Ge'ez carry traces of a long dialogue between Africa and the ancient Israelite world. This has led many scholars to admit that Ethiopia did not receive the Bible as a late copy. There is a linguistic and intellectual current that points to deep and sustained contact, not easily explained by simple missionary transmission. When a community preserves a ritual language structure for more than a millennium, it shows they did not merely memorize a religion, they lived inside it. Ethiopian art tells the same story, but with images instead of words. In ancient churches, Moses, David, Solomon, and even Jesus are painted with dark skin, curly hair, and features familiar to African people. This is not a modern adjustment responding to racial debate. These images are hundreds, even thousands of years old. They reflect how Ethiopians have always seen themselves in the Bible, without asking permission or offering explanation. Meanwhile, the Western world moved along a different path. Over centuries, the Bible was reimagined through European art in ways that drifted further from its original setting. Middle Eastern figures came to resemble Northern Europeans. This did not happen simply out of malice. It happened because power often recreates the image of God in its own likeness. But when that image is repeated long enough, it begins to be accepted as the only truth. Ethiopia, by not following that path, quietly became a mirror, not to prove who is right or wrong, but to remind us that many ways of seeing the Bible have existed side by side. And when people look at Ethiopian art, they do not only see a different style, they see a memory that was never erased. This memory is what makes Ethiopia so significant to those searching for identity. It does not need to prove that all Black people are Israel. It only needs to show that Black people are not strangers to Israel, that there were Black communities who lived within Israelite tradition very early on, in their own way, without dissolving into European models. In northern Ethiopia, on highlands where life remains closely tied to natural rhythms, there exists a community that has done this quietly for more than 2,000 years. They do not appear on the front pages of world history. They do not boast of empires, but they have law, ritual, and memory that refuse to disappear. They are called Beta Israel, the House of Israel. This community lived in isolation for centuries, practicing a form of Judaism based almost entirely on the written Torah. They did not have the Talmud, nor did they develop rabbinic legal systems like Jewish communities in Europe and the Middle East. This was not due to ignorance, but because their historical path diverged very early. As the Jewish world developed new branches, Beta Israel preserved an older form, closer to what is directly described in the Bible. They kept the Sabbath from sunset on Friday to sunset on Saturday. They observed Passover, the Day of Atonement, and dietary laws according to what was written, without many added interpretations. Especially striking were their laws of ritual purity, kept so strictly that many modern observers were surprised. Women during menstruation or after childbirth lived separately, exactly as described in Leviticus, not because they were devalued, but because the law was seen as sacred and to be preserved whole. For researchers, Beta Israel presents a difficult question. How could a Black community in Africa preserve such an ancient form of Judaism without very early connection to Israelite tradition? Genetic studies show clear traces of Middle Eastern ancestry, alongside mixing with indigenous Ethiopian groups over time. This does not weaken their story. It makes it more human, reflecting how real communities survive across centuries. When the outside world discovered Beta Israel in the 19th century, many Jews did not know how to place them. A Black Jewish community, unfamiliar with the Talmud, not speaking modern Hebrew, yet living according to the written Torah. This challenged familiar definitions of orthodoxy. It took decades of debate, doubt, and political struggle before Beta Israel was officially recognized and allowed to return to Israel. But even after recognition, they faced discrimination, suspicion, and demands for reconversion. That experience exposed an uncomfortable truth. Even within a religion built on the memory of exile, skin color and power can still determine who is accepted as authentic and who is required to prove themselves. For Black Hebrew Israelites, the story of Beta Israel is not a side detail. It is living evidence, proof that Black people can be keepers of ancient Israelite tradition, not as an idea, but as a lived reality spanning millennia. If this could happen in Ethiopia, then questions about other communities who lost memory through slavery and forced conversion become harder to dismiss. This story does not end with absolute certainty. It ends with complexity. But within that complexity, one thing becomes clear. Ethiopia did not only preserve books, legends, and art, it preserved living communities, flesh and blood people, who practiced Israelite faith in silence for far longer than modern debates have existed. And as the story continues forward, from the Ethiopian highlands to movements of identity awakening across the world, Beta Israel stands as a question that cannot be ignored, a question that forces anyone serious about seeking truth to confront this reality. If memory could survive here, in silence and isolation, then how many other memories once existed, only to be swept away by violence and forgetting? When a memory survives 2,000 years in silence, it forces history to slow down and look more closely. The story of Beta Israel is not only about return or religious debate. It is a mirror reflecting how the world decides who is called real, who must wait to be recognized, and who is doubted even after holding faith longer than many empires that rose and fell. When European Jews first encountered the Beta Israel community in the 19th century, they did not know where to begin asking questions. Before them stood black people praying according to the Torah, keeping dietary laws, keeping the Sabbath, and calling themselves the House of Israel. But they did not know the Talmud. They had not developed rabbinic legal systems like the Jewish world they knew. They lived the Bible in a direct, raw, and consistent way. This shook definitions that were once considered secure. A theological crisis emerged. If Beta Israel were truly Jewish, then many assumptions about skin color, geography, and authority collapsed. If they were not, then the next question was even more uncomfortable. How could a community keep such strict laws and rituals for millennia by mistake alone? There were no easy answers, and so the debate dragged on. Eventually, politics stepped in where theology stalled. The modern state of Israel, built on the idea of Jewish return, was forced to face the reality that there were black people in Africa also claiming that right of return. Operations like Moses and Solomon brought tens of thousands of Beta Israel from Ethiopia to Israel under urgent, dangerous, and historic conditions. But return did not mean the end of trials. Upon arriving in Israel, many Beta Israel were required to convert again, as if centuries of Torah observance were not enough. Many were questioned about religious purity, faced discrimination in housing, education, and marriage. For them, this was a painful shock. They left Ethiopia believing they were coming home, only to discover that skin color was still an unresolved question. This experience exposed a truth many prefer not to speak aloud. Even within a community built on the memory of exile, power can still define orthodoxy. Even within a religion centered on covenant, barriers can still be raised. And it is here that the story of Beta Israel begins to intersect directly with the experience of black people in America. Black Hebrew Israelites look at Beta Israel and see an undeniable precedent, not proof of every claim, but proof of possibility. If a black community in Ethiopia could be truly Jewish and preserve ancient tradition, then the idea that other black communities once had connections to Israel is no longer fantasy. It becomes a reasonable historical question, even if difficult to answer. This shifts the focus of the debate. It is no longer only about DNA or ancient texts. It becomes about how history was fractured. Beta Israel preserved memory because they were not put on transatlantic slave ships. They were not forcibly converted on a mass scale. They were not systematically stripped of language. They lived in isolation, and that isolation, though often painful, became a shield protecting memory. By contrast, the ancestors of African Americans experienced the opposite. They were torn from land, mixed with other groups, forbidden from practicing old beliefs, taught to forget their true names. In that context, the loss of memory is not proof that it never existed. It is the result of a deliberate process. Seen this way, the question of Black Hebrew Israelites changes tone. They no longer ask, "Are we Israel?" in a purely biological sense. They ask what happened to our memory, and if memory can be destroyed, then rebuilding it, even imperfectly, becomes an act of survival. Genetic studies complicate the picture further. Some African Americans carry genetic traces from the Middle East, but these traces can come from many paths: ancient trade, migration, or darker chapters of history. Science, instead of offering a final answer, opens more branches, and this frustrates many because they hope for undeniable proof. But history rarely works in such clean lines. Peoples do not move like straight paths on a map. They mix, separate, and meet again. What remains after thousands of years is rarely purity, but layers of memory, culture, and blood. Beta Israel, with genetic mixture and religious consistency, is a living example of this reality. For this reason, the story cannot end with a simple verdict. It cannot declare Black Hebrew Israelites entirely right or entirely wrong. It forces the listener to accept uncertainty. And within that uncertainty, one thing becomes clear. The search for identity is not always a journey back to a fixed point in the past. Sometimes it is the work of gathering fragments to create a story strong enough to continue living. Beta Israel preserved their story by living it every day. They did not argue much about who recognized them. They simply kept the law, prayed, and passed memory to their children. That, more than the world's late recognition, is the strongest evidence of their authenticity. And as this story moves beyond the Ethiopian highlands, it carries a heavy question. If memory could survive there, in silence and isolation, then what once survived within people carried across the ocean in chains? What was buried so deeply that only fragments remain, waiting to be called again in a new language? That question does not point only to the past. It points directly to the present, where movements of identity awakening begin to connect those fragments with older traditions. And it is at this intersection between Ethiopia, Beta Israel, and the modern Black experience that new figures begin to appear. People of the 20th century, carrying the Bible, politics, and dreams of liberation, ready to tie together a thread that was once broken. When an ancient memory rises in the modern world, it rarely appears in silence. It often carries the voices of people living under oppression, war, and the desire to stand upright. As the 20th century began, the thread connecting Ethiopia to Black identity no longer stayed only in monasteries or isolated communities. It stepped into the streets, into politics, and into liberation movements searching for a different future. Marcus Garvey was one of the first to see the power of that thread. He did not speak like a scholar, but like someone who deeply understood the pain of being erased. Garvey said Black people could not be free if they continued to see themselves through the eyes of others. He called on them to look toward Africa, not as a backward place, but as the cradle of stolen dignity and power. And in that vision, Ethiopia was not a vague symbol, it was a concrete promise. When Garvey quoted the prophecy that Ethiopia would stretch forth her hands unto God, he did not speak metaphorically. He spoke with the conviction that history and faith could meet inside politics. The coronation of Haile Selassie as Emperor of Ethiopia in 1930 was seen by many as the fulfillment of that prophecy. For Black communities searching for signs that they were not excluded from the story of God, the image of an African king claiming descent from Solomon carried undeniable weight. From Jamaica, Rastafari was born, taking Ethiopia as Zion, taking Selassie as a symbol of liberation. From Harlem, Black Hebrew Israelite communities began to form, blending the spirit of Garvey with the discipline and language of Israelite tradition. This was no longer the story of ancient manuscripts. It was the story of people living under racism, trying to redefine themselves through memories deeper than slavery. Figures like Wentworth Arthur Matthew did not only say black people were Israel, they built communities that lived as if it were true. They kept the Sabbath, followed dietary laws, studied Hebrew, and taught their children that their history did not begin with chains. Even when labeled strange or dangerous, they continued, because for them, this was not a simple religious choice. It was an act of saving themselves from invisibility. Some within the movement went even further. They did not want to return to Israel only in imagination. They wanted to return in body. Efforts to relocate black communities back to Ethiopia, even when unsuccessful, showed how serious this belief was. This was not a passive philosophy. It was a faith that demanded action, sacrifice, and the willingness to be misunderstood. The outside world reacted in many ways. Some saw this as a necessary restoration of dignity. Others saw it as a distortion of history, and some exploited it to fuel anger and division. This made the story more complex, because when a movement is born from pain, it can heal, but it can also deepen wounds if not guided carefully. In the decades that followed, the Black Hebrew Israelite movement fractured into many paths. Some groups focused on spiritual discipline, family, and education. Others spoke in harsher tones, using confrontational language, sometimes turning identity into a weapon. These were often the images amplified by media, causing the entire movement to be viewed through an extreme lens. But focusing only on the loudest expressions misses the core. Most people drawn to this story are not seeking conflict. They are seeking a place to stand, a story where they are not footnotes, not permanent victims, but central figures in a sacred journey stretching from ancient times to the present. Ethiopia, in this context, becomes a bridge. Not a perfect bridge, but strong enough for many to cross generations of inherited shame. When they hear of an African nation that preserved a fuller Bible, that had kings claiming descent from Solomon, that resisted European empires and survived, they do not only hear history, they hear possibility. This explains why the Ethiopian story continues to live in music, in speech, in informal conversations. It appears in hip-hop, in poetry, in street sermons, not always academically precise, but always emotionally real. The emotion of people trying to piece together a shattered picture. With that power comes responsibility. When a story becomes the foundation of identity, how it is told determines whether it heals or destroys. Branches that turn this story into justification for contempt lose the original spirit. That harms the very thing the movement seeks to protect, because an identity built by denying the humanity of others will collapse under its own weight. Here, the story demands maturity. It demands the ability to distinguish between affirming one's own dignity and attacking the dignity of others. Ethiopia, in its long tradition, never existed by diminishing other peoples. It existed by preserving memory, ritual, and the belief that covenant is responsibility, not permission to dominate. Looking back from ancient Ethiopia to modern movements, one truth becomes clear. This flow was never a straight line. It bent, broke, and was rejoined by people in different eras. Each generation added its own pain, hope, and interpretation. Not all of it was accurate, but not all of it was false. At its deepest level, this story does not demand total agreement. It demands honesty. Honesty about what history erased. Honesty about how memory can be distorted when fueled by anger. And honesty about how people need stories larger than their pain to keep living. As the 20th century passed and the world entered a new era of technology and information, stories once held in small communities spread faster than ever. Ethiopia, the ancient Bible, and Black Hebrew Israelites moved from the margins into global conversations about identity, faith, and justice. And at that point, a final question begins to form, not only for believers, but for all who are listening. If history can be rewritten, if memory can be erased and then rebuilt, what is the responsibility of this generation? To repeat old stories in voices of anger, or to go deeper and discover what within them can lead to true healing? When all the stories have nearly been told, what remains is not an answer, but a silence deep enough for people to face themselves. The story of Ethiopia, of the 81-book Bible, of Beta Israel and Black Hebrew Israelites does not close with a final verdict. It closes with a mirror. And in that mirror, each person sees something different, depending on what they are seeking. Some see hope, hope that Black history did not begin with chains, that there are chapters torn from the official book that are still waiting to be read again. For them, Ethiopia is not just a distant nation. It is proof that memory can survive violence, that covenant is not limited by skin color or borders drawn later by human hands. Some see danger. They worry that attaching modern identity to ancient stories can lead to extremism, division, and hatred. And that concern is not without foundation. History has shown many times that when people believe they are chosen and forget the responsibility that comes with it, faith can turn into a weapon. But the danger is not in the story. It is in how people use the story. If we look more closely, we see that Ethiopia never built its identity by denying others. Its tradition does not call for destruction or domination. It calls for keeping the law, keeping memory, and living faithfully within the covenant. Beta Israel did not survive for 2,000 years by arguing in public squares. They survived by living quietly, persistently, and passing on what they believed was right to their children. This raises an important question for the modern world. Perhaps the issue is not who is the true Israel, but who lives according to the spirit of the covenant. If the covenant is justice, mercy, and responsibility toward community, then it cannot be owned by any single group. It becomes a measure by which every community is examined, including the most powerful ones. Science, archaeology, and linguistics have made this story more complex, not simpler. DNA shows mixture. Ancient manuscripts show that many traditions once existed side by side. History shows that peoples have always moved, met, and influenced one another. There are no perfect straight lines, only tangled networks of people, memory, and belief. Within that picture, the Black Hebrew Israelites movement can be seen as a human response to deep loss. When a community is stripped of its history, it will try to rebuild it from what remains. Sometimes that reconstruction is accurate, sometimes it is more symbolic than provable, but the drive behind it is real. It is the need to see oneself in the larger story of humanity, not only at the margins. Ethiopia, with all its complexity, serves as a reminder that religious history does not belong exclusively to any center of power. The fact that the most complete Bible survived in Africa, that a Black Jewish community kept the law for millennia, that ancient traditions were preserved outside Europe, all of this forces the world to be more humble in how it tells its stories. Perhaps the greatest lesson from this journey is not deciding who is right or wrong, but learning to listen to stories that were pushed aside. When those stories are told, not to replace one monopoly with another, but to make the shared picture fuller and more human. This story also places responsibility on the listener. The responsibility is not to believe blindly or reject immediately, but to distinguish between searching for identity and nurturing hatred, between healing historical wounds and using those wounds to harm others. Not everything spoken in the name of ancestors leads to life. Looking back from beginning to end, one current runs through it all. Human beings, in every era, try to connect their pain to a larger meaning. For some, that meaning lies in science, for others, in politics, and for many, it lies in the Bible, in covenant, in the question of where they belong. Ethiopia shows that memory is not always kept in the loudest places. Sometimes it is preserved on the margins, by communities without the power to write textbooks, but with enough patience to pass stories on through voice. And those voices, when heard again after centuries, can shake what once seemed certain. The story of Black Hebrew Israelites, whether one agrees or not, has done something important. It has forced the world to confront how history is told and who is allowed to appear in the sacred story. It has pushed many to look at the Bible not only as a text, but as a space where memory and power struggle. As the light softens, what remains is not a conclusion, but an invitation. An invitation to reread history with less arrogance. An invitation to listen to communities that were once forced into silence. And an invitation to ask not only who our ancestors were, but what we will pass on to the next generation. Because in the end, identity is not decided only by the past, but by how people live with that past in the present. Ethiopia did not preserve memory because it won battles. It preserved it because it refused to forget. And in a world that always wants to move fast and discard what is inconvenient, that refusal to forget may be the most sacred thing of all. When the story closes, it does not shut any doors. It leaves doors open for those willing to step through with humility. Truth, if it exists in full, rarely belongs to one side alone. It often lives at the intersection of many stories, many memories, and many people searching for meaning in their existence. And perhaps that is the deepest covenant of all. Not a covenant of pure blood or exclusive power, but a covenant of remembering shared humanity. A covenant not limited by skin color, but tested by how people treat one another when they believe they have found the truth.
Grateful that you chose to spend these moments in the light of this story. If it touched your soul, please like, share, and subscribe, and ring the bell so the next whisper of light may find its way back to you.